Why did Senator Al Franken choose to write a memoir, and a funny one, now? He'll join us to talk about his new book, Al Franken, Giant of the Senate.
I didn't do, as far as my personal life and how I conducted myself during my life, is nothing compared to Donald Trump.
How did Winston Churchill and George Orwell respond to the threat of fascism? Tom Ricks will be here to talk about his new bestseller, Churchill and Orwell, The Fight for Freedom.
You could drop Orwell into a newspaper today, and it would just seem part of the paper. It wouldn't seem unusual at all.
What is it about comics and graphic novels that children, and adults of course, find so irresistible? Dav Pilkey, author of Captain Underpants and the Dogman series, joins us to talk about visual readers, the Captain Underpants movie, and his latest book.
I really want kids to associate reading with fun, because if they're having a good time, they forget that it's hard. Sometimes it is hard, especially if you're a new reader or a struggling reader.
Alexander Alter will give us an update from the literary world. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. Senator Al Franken joins us now. He is the author, most recently, of Al Franken, Giant of the Senate. Senator, thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
So why did you take the time at this moment to write this particular book?
Well, unfortunately, it didn't just take a moment to write this book. I actually started this in August of 2015, and there were a couple reasons I felt comfortable writing this. I had been reelected in 2014 by a pretty comfortable margin, and I felt it was okay to be funny again publicly. And also, it just happened that I was going to have a 5-day vacation with my wife, our first vacation in years together, just the two of us, at a lodge in northern Minnesota. And she got sick, so I ended up being in a cabin for 5 days, and I had always threatened to myself to write about all of this. And I just said, well, 5 days alone in a cabin, you know, this could turn out like The Shining, but I think I'm going to start writing. And I found out I enjoyed it. And the first thing I basically wanted to answer is the question I get asked the most, which is being a United States Senator as much fun as working on Saturday Night Live? And the answer, of course, to that is no. Why would it be? But it's the best job I've ever had, because you get to work on improving people's lives. And when you do achieve things, it's an amazing feeling.
Are there any parallels between Saturday Night Live and the work you did there and being a senator?
Well, you write sometimes as a senator. You write speeches, and that skill, that helps. Also, I perform some, so senators give speeches and perform in a way. Mm-hmm. So there are some transferable skills, but there are a lot that aren't. And there's some bad habits you get into as a comedian, which is feeling free to say things with irony and hyperbole and other literary tools that, when they're stripped away and put through a dehumorizer, which is a $15 million machine that the Republicans put together for my first campaign, built with Israeli technology, taking everything that made something funny out and leaving just the dry husk of something that seems offensive, then that was difficult.
What is the humor like in Washington these days? Is there a kind of gallows humor?
That's funny. Yeah. There is that. There is some dark humor about our situation. When I got to the Senate, of course, my Republican colleagues were maybe a little suspicious of me because I had used humor to heap scorn and ridicule on them for years.
Right.
But they very quickly got it. They said, oh, I get it. He laughs a lot and he's funny. That's why he went into comedy. So like even the first day after I was sworn in, Jim DeMint, the then senator from South Carolina, very, very conservative, comes up to me and says, how are things on the far left? And I said, they're great. How are things on the nutcase right? And he laughed, and we're friends since, just giving each other crap, but in a fun way. And my other colleagues, Lindsey Graham is just hilariously funny. I remember when he was like 16th out of the 17 Republican candidates in the last cycle for president. I went up to him and I said, Lindsey, if I were voting in the Republican primaries, I'd vote for you. And he immediately said, that's my problem.
Who is the funniest Republican right now in Congress?
It's Lindsey.
Lindsey.
It's Lindsey. Pat Roberts is also very funny. He's from Kansas, and he and I bonded over Jack Benny. We're both big Jack Benny fans. And very often in the Senate, I'll see him and say, may I help you? And he'll say, you again. And I'm doing Frank Nelson, who is a character actor on The Benny Show. He would always show up. And if Jack Benny were getting some perfume for his wife, he'd be at the perfume counter. Yes, may I help you? You again. So this is something that Pat and I do whenever we see each other, and people are puzzled.
Well, you go after, in a very funny way, some of your colleagues in this book. I think my favorite line, which has been widely quoted, is you say of Ted Cruz, I like Ted Cruz more than most of my colleagues like Ted Cruz, and I hate Ted Cruz.
Yes.
So I feel I'm in a safe place to ask, who is most lacking sense of humor in the Senate?
Oh, well, not Ted. Ted, actually, the reason I say I probably like Ted Cruz more than most of my other colleagues like Ted Cruz is that he actually has a sense of humor. He actually values humor. He doesn't have a great sense of humor, but he likes humor. And the least funny senator, in my experience, was Tom Coburn from Oklahoma. He's retired now. He's called Dr. No, as you may recall, for a couple reasons. One, he's a doctor, so he was an obstetrician gynecologist. The other is that he tended to put holds on other senators' legislation because he really didn't believe the federal government had a role in most of anything and was a federalist. So he did not have a sense of humor, and the first 4 or 5 times that we had exchanges that we missed, and I went up to him and I said, Tom, can I take you to lunch? And he said, well, I'll tell you what, take me to breakfast. So we go to breakfast in the Senate dining room a couple days later, and we sit down. And I say, look, for the next 40, 45 minutes, whatever it is, let's have fun, okay? He goes, okay. And I said, we can talk about politics if you want. We can talk about our families, our careers, but let's just have fun. He said, okay. So I said, okay, careers. What is the career? Let me ask you something. To be a doctor in Oklahoma, do you have to have any formal education? And he said, yes, you've got to go to medical school. And I said, okay, that was a joke.
Right, that didn't work.
Well, it did, actually, because I said that was a joke, and that's what I used to do in my career. And then we had a great breakfast. I explained what jokes were. I explained what the proper reaction to jokes was, and he wrote me a note afterwards saying he had a great time. And then I called Tom. I wanted to make sure this was okay for me to tell the story, and so I called him as I was writing the book, and I said, Tom, remember that breakfast, blah, 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 and he goes, yeah. I said, well, I'm thinking of putting it in the book, and I was wondering if it'd be okay with you. And he goes, there's the First Amendment. You can write anything you want. And I went, okay, well, it's just trying to observe kind of the protocols and the courtesy. And he said, well, you're a gentleman. And then we started talking about our grandchildren. We had fun again.
Did you check with Ted Cruz?
No, Ted is the exception. Ted had gone on the floor and broken all protocol by calling Majority Leader McConnell a liar. And, we're a small town. We're 100 people, the Senate.
Right.
And the only way you get stuff done is to be collegial. And Ted isn't collegial. He's just a toxic coworker. And he's not gotten anything done in his time in the Senate except shut the government down once. But in the chapter, I basically show that, he doesn't do the basic things. You have to be a person of your word, for example. And so he's the exception that proves the rule. But I have so many Republican colleagues that I work very well with because you have to.
This is a question that's come up with almost every writer who I've talked to whose book has come out at this moment, which is, to what extent was it a pre-Trump book and to what extent was it a post-Trump book? And did you have a chance to kind of go back and rework things? And how did the outcome of this election affect the writing of this book and the timing of its release?
Well, we knew when the release was going to be, and I had, written 85% of the book before November 8th. And when the election happened, I said, well, I'm going to have to deal with Trump, but I don't want it to be a tacked on history of the Trump administration until the book was locked. And so what I did was I sort of integrated Trump into what the book was about. Mm-hmm. For example, he lies a lot. And so I've written books called Lies and Lying Liars Who Tell Them. If they're unbalanced, look at the right. I wrote a book called Rush Limbaugh is a Big Fat Idiot and Other Observations. It was about talk radio and him lying. And so I kind of talk about how it's almost adorable that I was able to write books about lies and proving that people were lying and people gobbled them up. And now we're kind of in a post-truth world. So I talk about how we got there. And then I kind of compare my 2008 run, which is, there are some parallels between me and Trump, I guess, that I came from entertainment. And so much of, I talked about the dehumorizer built by the Republicans, so much of what they did was take my comedy out of context, but I didn't do, as far as my personal life and how I conducted myself during my life, is nothing compared to Donald Trump. Right. And so I get to talk about that. And then I also talked about where we are now and compare it to where we were after the 2004 election and how we came back. And part of it was institutions that were being created at the time, Air America Radio, which got our message out, the Center for American Progress, a progressive think tank here in Washington, and Media Matters, which pushed back on Fox News, and how we've knocked down privatization of Social Security. Karl Rove at the time was talking about a permanent Republican majority, but we beat that back, and in 2006 took the Congress back, and in 2008 we elected Barack Obama president and had large majorities in both houses of Congress. So I talk about what we need to do as Democrats to respond to this. So what I tried to do was integrate Trump into everything that I had been talking about in the book.
When you go through the titles of your previous books, they all look rather prophetic in their way of our current political moment. And I do, since you brought up the Rush Limbaugh book, what are your thoughts on Limbaugh today?
Oh, he's the same guy. He's lost some weight. Part of the reason we're here where we are is because he made it okay to say things that weren't true and be entertaining about it. And that was more fun than hearing the truth and thinking about it and hearing both sides of something. And so we have, because of talk radio, because of Fox News, because of the Breitbarts of this world, we have self-segmented our society, and there are people that select news that confirms their own bias. And we're very divided as a society, and we see that it's worse than ever right now, to the point where the president is calling you and CNN and others fake news, right, and the enemy of the American people. I think this is a much worse spot than we were at when I wrote Rush Limbaugh is a Big Fat Idiot and Other Observations, and when I wrote Lies and Lying Liars Who Tell Them, If They're Unbalanced, Look at the Right. But they were the roots of all of this. So was Gingrich, in terms of demonizing, making it okay to demonize your opponents, all of that.
One final question, which I know you've been asked a million times, but everyone is trying to read the tea leaves on this. I'm assuming this is a presidential campaign book, right?
Well, no. What's funny about this is that because Trump won, there's this kind of looking at this is really somewhat of a memoir, and it's kind of like, well, this Franken, he's written the perfect post-Trump, campaign, presidential memoir. That Franken, he's playing four-dimensional chess.
Right.
He's 3 moves ahead of everybody else, and he figured out that. And no. This is a book I was almost finished with when November 8th happened, and I don't want to do that. I don't want to run for president.
Well, I hope the book was as fun to write as it is to read.
Well, thank you. No, it was a lot of fun. I mean, when I was up at that cabin, and I went, oh well, I've told myself I'm going to do this someday. I've got 5 days here. It was so much fun, and it also helped me think about what I'm doing, how I'm approaching this job. And there's an old thing that judges say when they're writing an opinion, does it right? Mm. When I was writing this book, when I was thinking about any particular part of the book, but especially about the Senate, if something would write, then I knew it helped me think about it. It helped me think about my approach here in serving the people of Minnesota.
Senator Franken, thank you so much again.
Thank you. This has been a pleasure.
Al Franken is the author of Al Franken, Giant of the Senate. Thomas Ricks joins us now from Washington. His new book is called Churchill and Orwell, The Fight for Freedom. Tom, thank you so much for being here.
You're welcome.
So are you psychic? Did you start this book after the election? How did you know that this would be so of the moment?
I didn't. But what happened was, when I finished my last book, The Generals, I was sort of thinking, well, I'm finished with journalism. I'm just going to be a writer now, a book writer. And my farewell to journalism, I went back and was looking at a lot of 20th century journalists, wondering who's going to last, who will be remembered. I started with H.L. Mencken, found him anachronistic in style and wrong on politics. I turned to S.J. Perlman, didn't find him funny. I read E.B. White again, and I found White still has a wonderful prose style, but his concerns were not mine. Hemingway, just a blowhard. They all seemed kind of stale. And then I picked up Orwell, and it was stunning. Orwell just was fresh. His concerns are the concerns of today. He builds the vocabulary of today in some ways, with phrases like Big Brother and memory hole and doublethink. It just struck me. You could drop Orwell into a newspaper today, and it would just seem part of the paper. It wouldn't seem unusual at all.
Right.
And after reading Orwell for a while, I began to think, boy, there's a parallel here with Churchill. One from the left, one from the right. Both of them separating themselves from their own sides, being willing to critique their own side when they were wrong, insisting on principles and saying there are alternatives to fascism and communism in the 1930s. We don't have to have a totalitarian world, but in order to prevent that, we really have to focus on preserving liberty beginning at the atomic level of the individual.
Did you finish the book before the election results?
Well, I finished the book twice. A lot of writers don't like to talk about this. My editor hated my first draft. I finished the book first in December 2015. 3 weeks later, my editor, Scott Moyers, wonderful editor, I've done 5 previous books with him, basically sent me a letter saying, not only do I hate this, I really, really hate this.
Wow. That is some editorial letter.
Yeah, and it's good we have a trusting relationship. I redid the book like a carpenter who's built a house that didn't work. I took it apart, reassembled it according to his orders, make it narrative, make it chronological, put the people in front of the books, don't make it a book report. But I think that really helped tighten the book up and make it a much better read. So I finished the book, the second version, June, a year ago.
Wow. So you really were psychic then, is the answer.
I think it's really Orwell who is psychic. Orwell in the late 40s really discerns the problems of the next 50 years. The relationship between the state and the individual, the increasing encroachment of corporations in data mining and things like that. And I think that's one reason that Orwell has grown so in stature over the last 50 years, is increasingly it became apparent that he got it right.
Dual biographies are challenging no matter what in terms of structure and the narrative flow. And then you added a double challenge with this book because Winston Churchill and George Orwell never met. So how do you grapple with those two challenges?
The fun thing for me of them never having met was I didn't have personality get in the way. I didn't have to write about feuds or anything, the waxing and waning of a relationship.
Mm-hmm.
They were just on parallel courses, seeing the same events through different eyes, but coming to similar conclusions. I found that rather easy. The big problem with writing the book was Winston Churchill, who was a brass band of a human being.
You did not choose uninteresting characters for the book. I mean, Churchill in particular had a long life and so many lifetimes within that life. How did you kind of keep the focus? What years do you look at in particular?
Orwell dies at age 46 in 1950. Churchill lives about twice as long as he does. But the 30s and 40s is really the core of the story of both men and the fulcrum of our century as well, which makes it easy to go from the men to history and back. In fact, I would say that Churchill really had one great year, 1940, and for the rest of his life really didn't do much except write.
How did the 1930s shape each of them in particular, and what were the parallels?
The 1930s are a time a bit like today, political tumult, political parties, alliances shifting, and a lot of people thinking that opinion is more important than fact. So the Communist Party line was communism is good, therefore anything that helps communism is good. So lying to help the Communist Party is a virtue. And Churchill and Orwell, from the different perspectives, reject that kind of thinking. And they especially are willing to break with their own party, their own peers, in doing so. They both go into the wilderness, effectively, in the 1930s. Churchill spends the 30s breaking with his own conservative party and saying, no, Nazi Germany is rearming. Appeasement, the official policy of the party and of the British government. That appeasement of the Germans is not the way to go. It actually will lead to war and lead to a more difficult war because appeasement is making Germany stronger. Orwell, for his part, goes to Spain, fights in the Spanish Civil War, is amazed to find himself hunted, not by right-wingers, but by the Communist Party, led by the Soviet spy, the NKVD. Orwell then breaks with the left, says, no, I cannot blindly support everyone on the left. People on the left are lying just like people on the right. And he eloquently denounces what we would call false news nowadays. And he makes it his life's work to criticize and point out the abuse of power, especially by government, no matter whether it comes from the left or the right. But they both break with their own natural allies in the 30s, and that's what makes them so important and so powerful in the 40s.
You've argued that they are perhaps the two most consequential Englishmen of the 20th century. Why is that?
Well, Churchill effectively saved the West in 1940. If another person had been prime minister, England almost certainly would have made peace with Nazi Germany in 1940. When Churchill went into the Parliament for the first time, to the House of Commons as prime minister, he was applauded by the Labour members, but not by his own Conservative Party. So I think Churchill saved the world, saved the West, saved Western civilization, and then Orwell came along and pointed out the dangers to Western civilization that would follow the war. One thing that's forgotten about him is he probably was the person who coined the phrase the Cold War, using it even in the middle of World War II.
The parallels between Orwell's writing in particular and today are obvious. And as you know, 1984 has been sort of the surprise runaway bestseller of the moment. But the parallels between Churchill's writing and today might not be as obvious to some people.
Churchill's writings are best looked at as how the West was preserved. But he has the same points of departure, which is the liberty of the individual and the right to your own perceptions, which is a running theme through Orwell as well. Remember, probably the most important line in 1984 is when he writes that if you are allowed to say that 2 plus 2 equals 4, all other freedom flows from that, which is the ability to come to your own conclusion through your own perceptions and not allow the state or some other power to dictate to you what the facts are. And so I think Orwell sees that clearly. Churchill effectively embodies it in his life and his writing.
The two men, as we've said, never met, but they were not unaware of each other. What did Churchill make of Orwell and vice versa?
Churchill read 1984 twice and loved it, but as you say, never met Orwell. Remember, the hero of 1984 is named Winston, and this is at a time in England where there was only one Winston.
Mm-hmm.
He's writing in 1948. Churchill was just out of power a couple of years. All of the politicians were referred to by their last names: Chamberlain, Baldwin, Attlee. Churchill was known to the British public as Winston. And the last thing that Orwell ever wrote on his deathbed was an admiring review of Churchill's World War II memoirs, in which he saluted Churchill as writing not like a politician, but like a human being, and singled him out as a man of generous spirit. Churchill was, in fact, the only conservative leader that Orwell admired.
They were both known to be incredible prose stylists and persuasive writers, each in their own right. How do they compare for you as writers, and what was each their respective strength?
They are so different as writers. Orwell famously said that he wanted his prose to be as transparent as a pane of window glass. And he is. I think he really, in some ways, invents the modern style. Churchill's the opposite. If Churchill's prose were glass, he would want it to be the stained glass window at the end of a cathedral transept, full of reds and blues and yellows, and the light streaming through it. He loved color. One of his actually most enjoyable essays is his essay on painting, in which he expresses sorrow for the duller colors, brown and gray, and says, "I feel sorry for them." He liked the bright colors. He was a pageant of a man and a pageant of a writer as well.
Last question for you as a writer and reading these two tremendous writers while writing about them. Did you find that their own prose influenced your own writing of this book?
I didn't really think it did, but when I finished my second draft and Scott Moyers read it, he said, "Wow, reading Orwell has really paid off for you. You finally learned how to write." This is my sixth book with him.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's a good thing you have a nice relationship, because those are harsh editorial comments you get from him.
Oh, the harshest he ever said to me, I was belly aching once about the difficulty I was having writing a book, and he said, "Oh, come on, Tom. Every good book has at least one nervous breakdown in it."
Well, we all know here that Tom Ricks is a good writer because in addition to being the author of this book, he is also our military history columnist, and the book is already a bestseller. Tom, thank you so much for being here.
You're welcome.
The book again is Churchill and Orwell, The Fight for Freedom by Thomas Ricks. Dav Pilkey joins us now. He is the author of many, many books, including the Captain Underpants series, now a movie, of which he is an executive producer, and his latest series of graphic novels, Dog Man, and many other books. Dav, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Pamela. It's great to be here.
Most of your books are in the format of graphic novels. You've done some picture books, too. And you started off with Captain Underpants, I understand, in second grade. How did you get into writing the series?
Well, I had a bunch of challenges when I was a kid. I had ADHD before they even had a term for it, and I had dyslexia and didn't really fit in too well in the classroom, so my teacher was always sending me out in the hallway, and that's where I did a lot of my drawings, and Captain Underpants was one of the first things I ever drew. I've
heard this story, and I'm curious to hear a little bit more about it because you weren't diagnosed at the time. What did they say to you? What was the message you got about reading and sort of what was expected from you in the classroom?
Well, I was diagnosed with dyslexia, and they called it extreme hyperactivity back in those days. That was their word for ADHD.
Not slight hyperactivity, but extreme.
No, it was extreme. It was hardcore. And, there weren't a whole lot of resources for the teachers back in those days and for the kids. And so because I was very disruptive in the classroom, my teacher just sent me out in the hall.
But you were drawing these comic books and writing stories, so you were clearly interested in storytelling. Were you able to read with help with the dyslexia?
The thing that really helped me read was just practice. My teachers were always taking away the things that I brought in to read. Like I would bring in like Mad Magazine, and I would bring in joke books and things that I really liked, things that were very cartoon heavy, like collections of Peanuts cartoons and things. And my teachers would always take those away and say, oh, that's garbage. You don't want to read that. But when I came home, my parents, they had this radical thing. Like they were like, instead of focusing on what I was reading, they just wanted to make sure that I was reading. And so they let me pick out whatever I wanted. And that made a huge, huge difference.
If you could go back, it sounds like your parents had the right encouraging attitude.
Yes.
What would you have wanted your teachers to say to you? What message would have been helpful to you to hear at that time? Because I'm sure many listeners who have kids who are, quote unquote, reluctant readers or might have reading difficulties are looking for what their kids should hear ideally.
For me, as a child, it would have been very helpful to know that not everybody is the same. Everyone learns differently, and it's not necessarily a bad thing if you don't quite fit in. It would have been nice to hear that, because I just felt like since I was such an outsider and such a square peg in the round hole type of thing, that I was just going to be a failure in life. I didn't feel like there was any hope for me, really.
And was the message from teachers at that time that sort of these books, stories told in panels or in sort of a short format, not real books?
That's right. Yeah, it was the lowest form of literature. Yes.
So when you decided to begin writing professionally, did you deliberately want to write in that format?
Yeah, I was actually creating books for the kid that I used to be. A kid who really liked silliness, and I liked things that were illustration heavy because they helped me with comprehension when I was learning and struggling with reading. And so I was really writing for myself, and I'm still writing for myself, even though I'm in my 50s now.
And the books are obviously hugely popular. When you go around and you talk to kids who are Captain Underpants fans and Dogman fans and fans of your other series, do you hear from them the kind of things that you would have heard from yourself?
Yeah, I hear a lot from the parents, and actually from teachers and librarians as well, that for some reason my books seem to connect with certain kids. I mean, they won't pick up any other book. They think of reading as homework or punishment, but they will pick up my books for some strange reason, and they'll plow through them and they'll ask for more. And that's kind of the whole idea. I really want kids to associate reading with fun, because if they're having a good time, they forget that it's hard. Sometimes it is hard, especially if you're a new reader or a struggling reader. If you're having fun with it, you're more likely to continue reading and pick up more books and move on to other bigger and better things.
So I know for many years you were approached about making a movie or TV show or some kind of screen adaptation of Captain Underpants, and you resisted. Why was that?
Well, these characters in Captain Underpants, especially the two boys, they were based on me. They were very close to my heart, and I had this story arc that I really wanted to get out. I wanted to make sure that I had a chance to tell all the stories that I wanted to tell before I gave it away to someone else and let other creative people get involved.
The other criticism that I'm sure you've heard about your books is that, they're crude, it's potty humor. How do you respond to that?
I don't really respond to it. No matter what you do, there's always going to be somebody who doesn't like you. I try to focus on the positive, and that really is the message that I'm getting from parents and from teachers and things, that these books are really connecting with their kids. Their kids are choosing to read these books. They're putting their tablets down and they're going through books. A lot of these parents, all they want to do is just get on their knees and thank their lucky stars that their child has finally connected with a book. So I'm choosing to focus on the positive.
To ignore that part.
Yeah.
The books have appeared on the ALA's most challenged books list. And I know you just said you don't respond, but I mean, I'm sure that teachers have brought this up with you and parents.
Yeah. Again, going to the positive. Anytime I can be on a list with Mark Twain and Maya Angelou and Harper Lee, I want to be on that list. So I'm trying to look at the positive side of all that.
So you could very easily just stick with Captain Underpants because it's a huge franchise, but you've chosen to bring out this kind of spin-off character in the last, is it 2 years? This is your third book in the Dogman series.
Yeah. The first one came out, I think it was last summer. So the third one is coming out this summer, at the end of this summer.
And what was the thought behind starting a spin-off?
Well, I thought it would be interesting to see George and Harold grow up through their artwork. And so with this third book, they finally entered fifth grade, and they have a teacher who's insisting that they read classic literature. So she's starting them out with with Charles Dickens. And the boys figure out that they actually kind of like it, and it's actually inspired them. And so the themes and motifs of Dickens, especially from A Tale of Two Cities, is starting to show up in their work.
A Tale of Two Kitties.
A Tale of Two Kitties, right.
So what are the themes that you take from Dickens and incorporate in here?
Well, I think the idea of self-sacrifice. In the third part of Tale of Two Cities, the Sidney Carton character realizes, he's kind of been a scoundrel his whole life, but if he sacrifices himself, he can really find truth and value and his purpose in life. And so that kind of happens in this book as well, because the scoundrel of this series is Petey the cat, and he realizes at the end of this book that I don't want to give too much away, but
we don't want to have any spoilers on the podcast.
Right. But he does lay down his life. He sacrifices his life for someone else. He doesn't die. He gets saved at the end, so there is a happy ending. But I think it's a big revelation for him to realize that he's not the center of the universe. There really is more to life than just him. Is
this series a kind of geared towards slightly older readers? Is it for kids who've sort of graduated from Captain Underpants, or is it kind of working on the same level?
I think it could be more for older readers, but I've heard from parents who are reading it to their 4 and 5-year-olds, and those kids are loving it as well.
And how do you feel about the phrase reluctant readers?
I'm not sure that is a real thing, to be honest, because I thought I was a reluctant reader till I found the things that I loved to read, like Mad Magazine and joke books and comic books and heavily illustrated things. And once I found those things, I found out that I really did love to read. My mom would take me to the library and just let me pick out whatever I wanted. And that was kind of a radical thing back in the 70s. Like, teachers didn't recommend that back in those days, but because I was picking out what I wanted, I was actually reading, and that changed my life.
How do you work on the books? Because you do the illustrations and the text. Do you work on them both at the same time? Do you start off with pictures?
I usually start off with the title and the idea, and then I just plow through. I do it starting on page 1, and I just go consecutively, and I kind of write it and draw it at the same time.
Do you think of yourself as primarily an illustrator or primarily a writer, or are they connected?
They are connected for me. I think that's sort of the way I think. I'm very visual, and so when I think of stories, I'm always thinking in terms of pictures. So it's very connected.
The phrase visual readers or visually oriented readers has kind of replaced that phrase reluctant readers too, for many people.
And I think it's a great way for struggling and new readers to familiarize themselves with reading, because the pictures give contextual clues to the meanings of words, and that's really a great way not only to learn to read, but also to build your vocabulary.
Can you imagine you as a writer moving on to writing pure text without the pictures?
I don't think so. I know for some reason there's not a whole lot of interest in that for me. I love the way that the words and pictures play off of each other.
All right, I want to end with the deep burning question, which is, what is it about the potty humor that you think gets kids? I mean, what is it that everybody finds funny about potty humor?
I'm not sure. You may find this surprising, but I'm not actually a big fan of potty humor. I don't really think it's that funny. The thing that I think is funny is that children think it's hilarious, and that there are some adults who do not think it's funny. And I love the interplay between the kids and the adults. So I think it's kind of a nice gateway that gets kids, they see the covers and they think, oh, this is going to be lots of potty humor. Let's read this. And it gets them involved. And then they get into the stories and they find out it's not really about potty humor. It's more about friendship and creativity and empathy, things like that. And they end up enjoying themselves when it doesn't really deliver on the potty humor promise.
That was both a very meta answer and a trick that you're playing.
Yeah.
All right. Well, obviously, they are very effectively persuaded to read these books despite because of the absence of the potty humor. Although there is some potty humor.
There is some.
All right.
A little bit.
Dave, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Pamela.
Dav Pilkey is the author of many, many best-selling books for kids and some adults who enjoy reading them along with their kids. And the latest is coming out in August. Dogman, A Tale of Two Kitties, the third in the Dogman series. And his new movie, Captain Underpants, is out now. Alexandra Alter joins us now with news from the literary world. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
What's new?
So this week there were two novels that came out on the same day that represented returns for two novelists after a long hiatus. One was Swell by Jill Eisenstadt, and it's been 26 years since her second novel came out. So she has been writing a little bit of nonfiction and doing various things, but hadn't published anything in a really long time.
And people mostly just think of her for her 1987 novel, From Rockaway.
That's exactly right. She made a big splash with her debut novel. She was sort of heralded as part of this rising group of writers that were dubbed the Brat Pack,
the literary Brat Pack, as opposed to the really cool Hollywood Brat Pack.
Not the cool Ali Sheedy, Rob Lowe group, but Bret Easton Ellis, Jay McInerney. She was sort of grouped with them.
Mm-hmm.
And as happens, with early fame and early success came a good deal of criticism. I think that kind of left a psychic scar, and she felt like she couldn't write fiction for a while. But eventually she started taking notes for this story. She felt compelled to kind of write about the Rockaways and research it, and ended up publishing a new novel. Her first book was published by Knopf, and it was edited by Terry Adams. And Terry Adams edited this book. Terry's now at Little Brown. So I think that was a nice kind of return for both of them. And the other, even I think possibly bigger deal was, of course, Arundhati Roy, who has not published a novel in 20 years and published her second novel this week. It's called The Ministry of Utmost Happiness. And of course, when Roy's debut novel came out, The God of Small Things, it was a huge hit. It sold 6 million copies. It won the Booker Prize. She was this rising star. And then she went on to kind of get involved in politics. She published a good deal of nonfiction. She became an activist in India. She was involved in causes like, the Kashmiri separatist movement. She's very supportive of that movement. She was very much against the rise of Hindu nationalism and the ethnic violence in India, the nuclear disaster at Bhopal. And so she devoted a ton of energy to journalism and nonfiction and activism, and only now has come back to fiction and has sort of brought a lot of that material into her new novel, which I think is maybe resulting in some of the mixed reviews. People are thrilled to have something else from her, and they are talking about how her gifts are very much present on the page. But I think on the negative side, some of the critics have said, well, she's got all these big political ideas and it's a little bit didactic as opposed to her first novel, which was so personal and intimate.
She was such a rock star at the time, the first Indian actually living on the subcontinent to get the Booker, the first Indian woman to get the Booker Prize. It was just such a huge deal. The expectations could not have been higher for this novel, which is obviously really tough going into your sophomore fiction
Particularly,
effort.
After such a long hiatus, and with the combination of the massive commercial success of the first one and the massive critical success. The novel that wins the Booker often gets a big boost, but 6 million copies is really extraordinary.
And what's the reception been like of Eisenstadt's? Obviously, Arundhati Roy has been a little bit mixed.
I don't think there was as much anticipation for her. She wasn't as well known of a novelist. The review and the book review was sort of mixed. People are excited to see her returning to the Rockaways, which she was sort of made her name writing about, and it's kind of an unusual culture out there. The new novel takes place after September 11th, and it involves a couple that moves from Manhattan, from Tribeca to the Rockaways, kind of in the wake of that disaster to get some distance. And I think, interestingly, similarly to some of the critique of Arundhati Roy's new book, the reviews that I've read have said that she kind of overlaid it with this weighty event that happened and a little bit of politics, but didn't quite wrestle with it deeply enough. So again, it was like her first novel was very much about personalities, and this one has this massive national tragedy at the center. But that feels a little bit tacked on to some people. So.
Well, it'll be interesting to see how readers respond, as they don't always agree with us reviewers.
And I'm also curious to see, now that both Jill Eisenstadt and Arundhati Roy have kind of broken the ice and gotten back into fiction, will they produce another novel in the next 2 or 3 years or 5 years? Or are we going to be waiting another 20 from both of them?
And who else will come out of the woodwork of Writer's Block or whatever else?
It's going to be a while for Donna Tartt. She takes a while, but I'm excited for her next one.
We'll talk about it when it comes out.
We will.
And before then. Alexander, thank you.
Thank you.
My colleagues join us now. We've got Greg Coles, John Williams, and Parl Sagel. Hi, guys.
Hey, Pamela. Hey, Pamela.
All right, let's hear about what others are reading. Parl, do you want to start?
Yes, I'm reading a book that's impossible for me to describe. It's Gaston Bachelard's book, The Poetics of Space. He's a French philosopher, and he's written this, it's this book about how this is the best I can do. We live in houses, but houses also, they train our imagination. Our imagination comes from the spaces we live in. So we all know that we have a different emotional response to the idea of an attic or a cellar or a locked box or a corner. And it's this sort of spiraling meditation on shapes and imagination and language and how we are the space we inhabit. It's so good. I keep going back to it. I read it like every couple of years. And I was just telling John on the way here that it's one of those books that once you read it, you see everything very differently. Or you see spaces differently. You see sentences differently. You understand that we're, as humans, always putting ourselves physically into things, into language, into music. And it sort of like really does mimic for me in a certain way what I was like when I was very small. You know, like kids are always looking like, can I fit under there? You know, what's behind this?
What's
like,
in that cardboard box?
Right.
I'll
like
put
it's a very
myself in
magical book in this way. Then you really do think about thoughts like this. Like, can I pull that apart? Like you start to see things as solid in this way. And I know I'm making this sound like very
French.
Very French and kind of numinous, but it's
well, but it is. I've only dipped into it, but it's strange.
It's not the easiest book to read, but I think that if you stick with it, you'll understand why this book is so beloved by philosophers, architects, by a certain kind of experimental writer. Mark Danielewski is a huge fan of it. So people that like to build structures of thought are very fond of this book because it's also it's very tender. Like it's somebody who really I think also is very in touch with who he was as a child and and has this like softness when it comes to thinking about the childhood home and the way that children look at scale. And
when is it from? When was it written?
It was written 1958.
Seems like you've definitively moved out of your self-described sort of maternity, post-maternity reading period with this book.
Yeah, although, I think so. But this book also does have to do a lot with like maternity. Everything has to do with maternity for me because it is also this idea of like being inhabited, you know. And I remember I did read this book a little bit right after my daughter was born, and it was very interesting to think of oneself as a kind of house, you know, as a kind of structure. And and Bachelard has this great chapter on roundness, and it's quite something that if you are a pregnant woman, you do see how you kind of disarm people. I just remember like being able to diffuse a lot of tension when I would walk into a room because I did look like this
Circles
little Teletubby, you know. I was very angry, but there was this. So anyway, it's I really do recommend it, and it's a lovely book. John, what are you reading?
To circle back and answer Greg's question, it's a very nice Penguin classic.
It is a Penguin
edition.
Classic.
I am practicing literary self-care, and I am returning to Anita Bruckner, who I talked about last year on the podcast. And we figured out, Parl and I, that Parl was not here the week that I talked about her because
I would have.
You're also a big fan.
Really...
So I just sort of picked up another of her novels, which is called Latecomers, and it's about two men who were friends. They were brought over to England together from Nazi Germany when they were children. They weren't brought over together, but they were each brought to England by their families to flee Nazi Germany. And they both are sort of escaping their childhood and trying not to think too much about the past. They go into business together. They have very different personalities in terms of running the business. They eventually have children, and we get to know them. And Bruckner is such a great writer sentence by sentence, but she's also she's just obsessed with psychology, so that every page she could write 10 or 12 pages about just someone's decision to, you know, pick up a plate a certain way and just use that to kind of go into everything about them. And there's very little dialogue. And I can see now as I sort of near the end of this book that for some people, you know, if you read for plot or if you read for propulsion, like this might become exhausting. Because it's just very dense. What is the essential Bruckner-ness, though, of her? So it's psychology, but like what is she trying to answer any particular questions when you read her, do you think? People call her sad and grim. Yeah. She can also be mordantly funny. Yeah. There's a line in here about someone who's killed during war, and it says something like, he was killed while she was still wondering how to divorce him. That kind of thing. Just very, you know, obviously dark, but funny. No, I think it's really about, it's like about longing. Like these two guys, there's a lot in this book about one of the characters is, you know, more interested in his past than the other. He sort of wants to go back to Berlin and wants to piece together some of what happened to him and his family. And the other gets along by just totally repressing that. And he's this, you know, very sharp businessman, and he just kind of pretends that the past doesn't exist. But she's great at getting at how you can't do that, and how, you know, the guy who wants to recapture the past can't, and the guy who doesn't want to recapture the past inevitably does a little bit. And it's very subtle, but if you've lived through basically anything, I think you'll get something out of her books. And she's just a lovely writer, sentence by sentence, too, this incredibly classical sort of British style. What about you, Greg? What are you reading?
Well, you remember last week I was reading the Jim Harrison novella collection, Legends of the Fall, and the title novella in that book...
The one with Brad Pitt.
Yes, the one that was made into the Brad Pitt movie. It hinges on World War I. It opens as three brothers are marching off to fight in the war, and one of them dies there, and it follows the other two brothers, the consequences after that. And so that book has transitioned very seamlessly for me into a collection that was published earlier this year to coincide with the centennial of America's entry into World War I. It's a collection published by the Library of America called World War I and America, told by the Americans who lived it. It's edited by the great biographer A. Scott Berg, who won a National Book Award for his biography of Max Perkins. He won a Pulitzer for his biography of Charles Lindbergh. He also wrote a biography some years back of Woodrow Wilson, and so he's very kind of steeped in World War I and its surrounding culture. There's a real magpie effect to it. It's journalism and song lyrics and letters home from soldiers and nurses. There's also speeches from Wilson and other politicians of the era.
Are you reading it straight through, or are you just sort of
I'm not.
flipping around?
It lends itself to flipping around. I've actually been reading a lot of the journalism in it. It opens, of course, with the Archduke's assassination. I was at an event last night celebrating the Library of America's 35th anniversary, and Scott Berg talked there. And as part of his talk, he singled out the journalist Floyd Gibbons, the war correspondent. And I had never heard of Floyd Gibbons. He said that he had often heard of him but never read him, and reading him was really a revelation. So I jumped to that area.
Who did he write for?
Let's see. This is for the Chicago Tribune.
Can we also just appreciate that Floyd Gibbons is an amazing name?
It is an amazing name. It is an amazing name. He was an amazing writer. I'm going to read you just the first couple of paragraphs of a piece that he wrote that's included in here called Wounded, How It Feels to Be Shot. And I should set this up that he was in Europe to report on the fighting, but while he was there, he tried to rescue a wounded Marine officer and was in fact shot himself, which is what he's writing about in this piece. Just how does it feel to be shot on the field of battle, he writes. Just what is the exact sensation when a bullet burns its way through your flesh or crashes through your bones? I always wanted to know. As a police reporter, I covered scores of shooting cases, but I could never learn from the victims what the precise feeling was as the piece of lead struck. For long years, I had cherished an inordinate curiosity to know that sensation, if possible, without experiencing it. I was curious and eager for enlightenment, just as I am still anxious to know how it is that some people willingly drink buttermilk when it isn't compulsory.
That's so mid-century.
Classic Gibbons.
Classic Gibbons. Floyd.
That's amazing.
Pamela, in what danger was your author in when they wrote their book? What are you reading?
I don't know about danger, but I just finished Robert Gottlieb's book, Great Expectations, about the sons and daughters of Charles Dickens, which, Paul, you've read also. What's interesting about Dickens is he had 10 children, probably 11. It's not been 100% affirmed, but probably an 11th child. And of these 10 children, 2 were fairly successful, and the other 8 were pretty much not, at least according to, society's definitions of what success was, and certainly according to Charles Dickens. And he kind of adored them all as babies and then quite rapidly grew disenchanted with each of them and sort of shipped them off to various careers, kind of, sent 2 off to Australia, 1 went to sea. There are many great details in this book, and it's just like a very nice, narrow view of this one aspect of Dickens's life. One of the things I really enjoyed about it, and I think Bob Gottlieb, the author, enjoyed it weirdly too, was the mysterious ways in which deaths were written about at that time, because there was never proper diagnoses, at least, according to modern medicine. And there was one son, I think it was Frank, who took a drink of a cold glass of water and abruptly choked, sort of gasped and said it was the cold water and dropped dead.
Oh my God.
And, just what actually happened, you do not know. And so they all
I'm not sure modern medicine would figure that one out.
At the time they thought it was the cold water, which is clearly impossible. So they all kind of expired in these really mysterious and dramatic ways. That's ending it on a grim note. I will say that one of the most touching characters was Plorn, who was
Speaking of great names.
the great name. Plorn got his name because the Dickens family would perform a 12th night play that Dickens would write himself, and they would all rehearse during the 12 days after Christmas and then put on. And Plorn, at the age of 3, had a major role. And he was introduced as, and I'm going to completely mangle this, but it was something along the lines of the great Plorn Magooster Rooster, who has stayed up late at great expense. And this then devolved into a number of other sort of related nicknames. He was called like the Plorn Maroon and the Plornamageister and just these, other names. And
This
then
is something
finally,
my dad would do.
Or my wife.
right. Finally, it became Plorn. His name actually was Edward. So he was this kind of tragic figure in the book. That's what I've been reading. The Great Plorn Maroon. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Pamela.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Inside the New York Times Book Review is produced by Pedro Rosado. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.